Now, if you like fresh oysters, then you're going to like what our next guest is trying to do. We got Tom Mohrman. He's the Director of Marine Programs at the Nature Conservancy, and they're up to some good. So welcome, Tom.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thanks for having me on the show.
Well, I think it's always important when we're trying to take care of our wildlife in and out of the sea, but this one particularly is in it, and it's specifically on oysters. So when did this become an issue or topic of conversation that maybe we needed to look at helping, saving, rescuing, or however you want to describe it, the oysters here in Mississippi?
So around the year 2000, word started getting out that we were losing oyster resources throughout the world. Mississippi was kind of one of the last places for that to happen just because of the way oysters have been fished out of other locations. But the Gulf of Mexico is one of the remaining strongholds to a degree, but we still need to work on keeping that resource growing.
So what are we doing to that? Because nobody wants to see oysters go away or rise in price like crawfish have, to be honest. And that means that we have to make sure that there's a healthy supply and that they're well taken care of. So what is the Nature Conservancy doing about that?
So in Mississippi, one of the projects that we have going on is supported through the Mississippi Outdoor Stewardship Fund, Tidelands Fund Program, and the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And that's to build a subtidal oyster reef in Bay St. Louis.
And what would that do? Is that like a man-made reef, Tom, or is that like I'm just sort of beefing up what is already there? How does that work?
It's a little bit of both. So there was some existing oyster reef that was planted back in the early 2000s, and we're expanding on that project area. It would consist of transporting limestone that would come from Kentucky and basically creating a series of mounds. So these mounds are deposited. They're basically cone-shaped. They're about 1 foot to 2 feet tall, and they're creating vertical height. So that vertical height is really important because it creates surface area for new oysters to attach to.
So it's one of the biggest issues, Tom, is that their environment for habitating or mating or whatever oysters do to make baby oysters has been destroyed, or is it just that we're overfishing the oysters, or is it both?
So we had a major ecological impact from the opening of the Bonacary spillway around 2019. So our Mississippi Sound was inundated with fresh water for a very long duration. So it can take some impacts from freshwater if they're short in duration, but the opening that year happened to be a record. And basically what happens to you if you're an oyster, if you're exposed to fresh water for too long, you basically, as a defense mechanism, shut your shell and you stop feeding. So they're filter feeders. They need to have their shells open all the time. And when that fresh water hit, and when it lasted for several months, they weren't able to eat, and essentially that caused a very large mortality for oysters in the state.
So they're more like us than we realize. If we don't eat, we perish, and so we need to make sure that our oysters have an environment to stay healthy and full. Okay, so how do oysters make baby oysters? I mean, I don't think they're actually babies, but I mean, how does the reproduction sort of happen so we can get our supply back up?
So that's a great question, and our project actually is intended to serve as what we would call as a brood stock reserve. So it's not in the commercial harvest area, but it is located where when it does produce babies, those will float in the water for about 2 weeks as a larva, and then they'll settle out. And hopefully as they're drifting through the water column, about 2 weeks might get you out to the commercial grounds where there is locations for commercial harvest.
But the other, you'd hope that they settle on your, man-made reef, or the built-up reef there, and then they would be able to grow and multiply in that way as well?
Yeah, so there's oyster larvae in the water pretty much all the time. There's usually peaks in the spring and fall, but those oysters are floating in the water column, and hopefully when they settle out, they need to hit something hard like a rock or another oyster shell. So they can't survive in the mud like a clam can. And if they land on a suitable substrate and it has the appropriate water conditions, then it will be successful, hopefully, for a while.
When this project is successful, Tom, we're going to think positive thoughts here on good things. Should, like, nature, I guess, balance itself out, assuming that no more fresh water comes in, assuming that nature finds its way back to reproducing, should it get back to a good balance the way we were prior to 2019?
Well, Mississippi Sound naturally fluctuates in salinity, and that's actually a good thing because one of the major predators for oysters are an oyster drill. And there are also some viruses that potentially benefit from changes in salinity. So when you fluctuate from salty to fresh, that reduces the impact of both those from a freshwater side and a salty side. So a little bit of fresh water for a short duration is actually pretty good at controlling some things. So when the reef starts getting colonized, it should self-produce oysters for self-sustainability.
Other than the fact that we shouldn't just let something die off, that would just be bad manners, Tom. And other than the fact that maybe we just like to eat oysters and we would like to see that production ramp back up in the Mississippi Gulf Coast, what's the importance of just making sure that this gets back stable from an environmental standpoint? Like, why is it important to make sure that oysters are habitating the reefs, are still on the Mississippi Gulf Coast?
Well, oysters are a habitat unto themselves, so they're kind of analogous to what most people would think of a coral reef in a tropical environment. They're a three-dimensional structure that attracts invertebrates like shrimp and crabs and worms, and in turn, those are good for smaller fish and recreationally important fish. So they create a system where they're providing habitat and food for other marine animals, but they're filter feeders, so they help clean the water from some of the nutrients that we have out there, and that provides a valuable service in reducing nitrogen to the environment.
I never thought about worms in the ocean until today, Tom. I don't know why. I thought that. I guess there's all kinds of creatures in there that we don't think about it on a daily basis that have their purpose, right?
Absolutely. So somebody's eating them somewhere.
Ugh, worms out of the sea? It's like a delicacy?
Well, I mean fish, not people.
Okay. I mean, I guess I've heard of Stranger Things. Again, I'm sure they have a more appropriate term than just worms, but anyway. If people want to be part of this or see it through, Tom, is there a way that the average Mississippian can sort of support what you guys are doing with the Nature Conservancy?
Well, one of our other projects is we're going to be working with restaurants to collect oyster shells to be used for restoration purposes. And at some point in the near future, if you're on the coast and you see a restaurant that is participating in a shell recycling program, I hope you take advantage of that and let them know you support that kind of work and maybe buy some oysters.